This is the continuation and conclusion of this section of the Discourses on the removal of Sanskaras, Part 3, the wiping out of Sanskaras. Love for the Sadguru, or perfect master, is particularly important because it invites contact with the Sadguru. Through such contact, the aspirant receives from the Sadguru impressions which have the special potency of undoing other past impressions, thus completely transforming the tenor of his life. The recipient of the impressions may entirely give up old habits of life and ways of thought. Such contact changes and elevates the tone of the most depraved life. A person might have been leading a life of reckless dissipation without ever thinking of anything other than the fulfillment of mundane desires. He might have been caught up in the thirst for possession and power with no ideal other than that of acquiring and hoarding money and making merry. But even such a person who cannot, by any stretch of imagination, think of freedom from earthly fetters, may find that the Sanskaras which he catches from his contact with the Sadguru are potent enough to drop forever a curtain on his old manner of thought and existence, and open for him entirely new vistas of a higher and freer life. The impressions received from the Sadguru might be equally beneficial to an intellectual and cultured person, whose vision is nevertheless circumscribed, whose imagination can at best appreciate the beauty of art and literature, and whose altruism cannot go beyond the limits of his neighborhood or the boundaries of his country. Such a person would, on receiving impressions from a Sadguru, be lifted to still higher modes of life. The Sadguru can raise the aspirant from the ordinary intellectual level of consciousness to the level of consciousness where there is inspiration and intuition, and then onwards to the level of insight and illumination, which culminates in his merging into the infinite. This rising of the aspirant corresponds to his progress from the mundane sphere to the subtle sphere, from the subtle sphere to the mental sphere, and finally, from the mental sphere to the state of freedom. The last step implies complete wiping out of all Sanskaras, natural or non-natural, positive or negative. To take the analogy of the string which is wound round a stick, this process of the wiping out of Sanskaras consists in cutting the string with a pair of scissors. The erasing of all Sanskaras, which is implied in the final release of consciousness from all illusion and bondage, can never be achieved except through the grace of a Sadguru. But such active intervention by the Sadguru presupposes unrestrained relationship between the aspirant and the Sadguru, which can be established only when the aspirant succeeds in complete self-surrender to the Sadguru. Self-surrender implies obedience to all the orders of the Master. When all your desires and actions are guided by him and are the result of your obeying his orders, he becomes directly responsible for them. Thus, when self-surrender is thorough, the responsibility for your release from Sanskaras is devolved upon the Master, and under this new condition, the Master annihilates all your Sanskaras in no time. Obedience to the Master, as implied in full self-surrender, is of two kinds: one, intellectual, and two, literal. Of these two types of obedience, intellectual obedience comes first and is a preliminary to literal obedience, which is more fruitful. When you are intellectually convinced about the greatness and perfection of the Master, you have love and respect for him, but are unable to follow his orders literally. Reason being the basis of your conviction, you find it difficult to divorce it from your understanding of the Master and his orders. As the two are inextricably intertwined with each other, your reasoned faith holds you within the limits of intelligible obedience. This phase of the pupil is left undisturbed by the master, and all the pills of obedience offered by him are intellectualized in order to suit his taste and caliber. Through intellectual obedience to the master, you can annihilate all your sanskaras, provided you are sincere in your logical interpretation of his orders and in their execution, but the result comes much quicker if your obedience is literal. Literal obedience is the effect of the rock-like faith and deep love which the master inspires in the pupil through his human appeal. The overflowing radiance of the master's halo and the effulgence of his purity and compassion are mainly responsible for creating in the pupil an unswerving faith which prepares him to follow the master's orders implicitly, irrespective of their satisfying his critical spirit. Such literal obedience is not even bound by the requirement that the real significance of the orders should be within the intellectual comprehension of the pupil, and it is the best type of obedience for which you can aspire. Through such implicit and unquestioning obedience, all the crooked knots of your desires and sanskaras are set straight. It is also through such obedience that a deep link is created between the master and the pupil, with the result that there is an unhindered and perennial flow of spiritual wisdom and power into the pupil. At this stage, the pupil becomes the spiritual son of the master, and in due time he is freed from all individualistic and sanskaric ties. Then he himself becomes a master. The Sadguru, or perfect master, has a position and power which is unique. There are many souls in the world who are more or less advanced on the spiritual path, but there are few who have crossed all 6 stages of the internal spheres of consciousness and become one with the infinite source of existence, knowledge, and bliss. The Sadguru has not only experienced the different planes of consciousness, but he actually permeates the very being of all souls because of his having become one with the infinite. He is the pivot of universal activity. In a sense, to him are due all your thoughts and actions, your joys and sorrows, your frets and fumes, your strength and weaknesses, your possessions and surrenderance, and your love and longing. He not only pervades all existence, but is consciously conversant with the cosmic law of cause and effect and the complex working of the sanskaras of the individual souls. The causes of individual happiness or misery, vices or virtues, are as much known to him as the causes of cosmic changes and upheavals. Every being is an open book for the infinite searchlight of his omnipresent consciousness. Because of his union with the infinite, he is endowed with unlimited power, and in the twinkling of an eye can annihilate all the sanskaras of the soul and liberate it from all entanglements and bondage. I wanted to mention that in addition to these discourses on sanskaras, there is also a very considerable amount of information on the entire subject in Meher Baba's God Speaks, of course. Also, in the second part of Listen Humanity, there is an additional further body of material given out directly by Baba, of course, and carefully checked by Baba. There are still, even so, certain, what should I say, usages of words, phrasing, that can cause one to feel that there may be contradictions or confusions at some points, or even gaps in the total picture that Meher Baba paints for us concerning sanskaras. I told him at the end of the work that I had been doing on the Discourses, sometime later, that it was very difficult, even so, after all the work that I had spent, to arrange the material in what seemed a completely consistent and logical order. Mayor Baba, instead of becoming annoyed with me, as I thought he very well could after such a frank exposition, looked pleased and smiled and said, "Yes, Don, this I know, and it is very necessary for me to give out some further clarifying and completing information, which I intend to do." Some time after Mayor Baba had dropped the body, I asked Arish about that and whether, without my having, of course, any knowledge of it, Mayor Baba might have given a considerable further body on Sanskaras to Arish himself. Arish looked at me and said, "No, Don, he did not." And I said, "But he promised that he would do it." And Arish again smiled and said, and without attempting in any way to put me down, "But Don, he didn't say in which incarnation he would do it." So apparently we still have a bit of time. But the body that he has already given us is absolutely unique in this extraordinarily important area of what Sanskaras are and how they function in not only human life, but in the formation of God's infinite consciousness itself.